I want to start. I want to read an extended portion from chapter 9 of Romans. I think it's really important that we start with that sort of context. So I'm gonna just read what Paul has to say in Romans chapter 9. And some of you may be very familiar with this. Some of you may have forgot that Paul wrote this. When you read through it and maybe you've seen it for the first time or reminded of it sort of sounds just unfair. So pay attention to what he has to say here. It is not as though God's word had failed, for not all who are descended from Israel are Israel, nor because they are his descendants are they all Abraham's children. On the contrary, it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. In other words, it is not the children by physical descent who are God's children, but it is the children of the promise who are regarded as Abraham's offspring. For this was how the promise was stated: at the appointed time, I will return and Sarah will have a son. Pretty non-problematic there. I just wanted to set the stage for what Paul's going to say next. Not only that, but Rebekah's children were conceived at the same time by our father Isaac. Yet, before the twins were born or had done anything good or bad, in order that God's purpose in election might stand, not by works, but by him who calls, she was told, the older will serve the younger, just as it is written, Jacob I loved, but Esau I hated. And there's our first kind of hint that, wow, here it is. Somebody's born and they're already predestined to play a particular role in God's plan, as we see in ancient Israel. What then shall we say? And of course, I think Paul recognizes this doesn't sound fair. He says, is God unjust? And he says, no, not at all. For he says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I have compassion. Now, I don't know about you, but that doesn't really set me at ease a lot, because it sounds like God's now being arbitrary and saying, it's okay, I can do this. It's because I can choose who I want to have mercy on. Okay, well, keep going here. If it does not, or it does, excuse me, it does not therefore depend on human desire or effort, but on God's mercy. For the scripture says, the Pharaoh, I raise you up for this very purpose, that I might display my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. Therefore, God has mercy on whom he wants to have mercy, and he hardens whom he wants to harden. Now, I'm not sure this is getting any better. This again sounding like God is predestining particular individuals for particular outcomes in their life. And in fact, it doesn't sound like Pharaoh has much chance of being saved in this context. One of you will say to me, then why does God still blame us? Oh, there's a good point. For who is able to resist his will? But who are you, a human being, to talk back to God? Shall what is formed say to the one who formed it, why did you make me like this? Does not the potter have the right to make out of the same lump of clay some pottery for special purposes and some for common use? What if God, although choosing to show his wrath and make his power known, bore with great patience the objects of his wrath prepared for destruction? What if he did this to make the riches of his glory known to the objects of his mercy, whom he prepared in advance for glory? Even us, whom he also called, not only from the Jews, but also from the Gentiles. Okay, I'll stop there. That's the portion I wanted to share. And of course, I think it's important that we keep these verses in context of all of Romans. And I know I've studied Romans a lot. And when I was in college, it was one of the books that we spent time on in one of my exegetical classes when I was studying theology. And I know there are ways around some of this seeming unfairness that's here, and there's other ways to interpret it, and so on and so forth. But we do know that people like, for example, John Calvin took passages like this and saw them as predestination. In fact, he felt that God already knew who was going to be saved, and he'd chosen who would be saved and who would be lost. So we know that at least some theologians have clearly read this out of here, and it does sound like it if you read it straight as written. And I would say that I've always been troubled, even with the larger context, that this seems to hint at some kind of unfairness. And I think it challenges a little bit of the Adventist theodicy that we have in the Great Controversy, for example, because doesn't the Great Controversy suggest that we each have a choice to make and that we are free to make that choice? And this doesn't sound like free will being described here. This sounds like at least for some people, if not all of us, but he's talking about specific individuals here, that at least they didn't have any will to choose, that they were chosen for a particular goal. Which brings me just to a brief cartoon that I think brings up the issue here in a different way. And this is a woman in to see her psychiatrist, and she's kind of grappling with this idea of predestination. Here she says, "I'm not sure I follow that predestination stuff. I like the idea of free will." And the therapist answers back, "What makes you say that?" Indeed, what makes her say that? And that's kind of the root of it here is what makes me who I am. Is it something that I have some part in doing, or am I already determined at birth to be a certain kind of person? Does God predestine each of us from birth? That's a Calvinist idea, of course, and there are a lot of people who believe that God clearly has a plan for my life, and I'm already set for life. Um, that has some interesting implications, by the way. If you happen to believe that, then you might try to second guess yourself, or you think, well, I don't have to do anything, right? Because it'll just happen. But that itself might change things. So there's a lot of philosophy kind of tied up in here that we don't really have time for there. But do we, as I think as Adventists, we often think we become who we are because of the way we're raised by our parents and teachers, and thus the great emphasis on education in Adventism. I become who I am because my parents shape me, and my teachers at school teach me things that make me a better person. And I then learn the gospel, and I fit into this plan that God has for each person to choose Him. But now in modern times, of course, we have had more and more knowledge and information that we've gained from the study of genetics. And there have been a lot of people throughout the 20th century who have begun to ask the question, do our genes determine who we are? Well, I want to say right out, genes themselves do not completely determine who we are. But I can say that the consensus is that they certainly play a part. So we have to take that seriously. And does that mean that our genes are part of what may be predestining us to be certain ways? So does modern science give any clues to this? And it certainly does. Now, in order to get into the genetics of this, I'm going to start really simple because I don't know where everybody's background is. Some of you may not have had any biology since maybe grade school and high school, and some of you maybe didn't even take it in high school. So I'm going to start with the father of genetics just briefly and kind of work into the topic and talk about how genes affect character traits in plants first, because that's what Mendel studied. Most of you have heard of Gregor Mendel and Mendelian genetics. He was a monk, and later he was the abbot of the monastery he was at. And it was not uncommon in those days, of course, for people in religious orders to do research. He originally wanted to do his genetic studies on mice. And by the way, he didn't call it genetics back then. It wasn't genetics. There was no such field. But he was interested in inheritance. And he thought about mice first, but that didn't work out so well. And he later switched to peas. And he presented his results in 1865, which I think is good to think of the context here for just a moment. 1865, that's a few years before the molecule called DNA was discovered, because DNA was discovered in the latter part of the 19th century. Its structure wasn't learned until the 1950s, but it was at least known as a molecule way back then. Nobody suspected it was genetic material, by the way. Also in 1865, let's see, Civil War. It's also 6 years after Charles Darwin published his Origin of Species as another kind of scientific thing going on at the time. Nobody yet had seen a chromosome during his lifetime. And the current understanding of inheritance was a thing we today refer to typically as blending inheritance. Let me just briefly describe that. They believed that babies were composed of course, the egg and the sperm, but the egg and the sperm themselves were composed of pieces, little gemmules from the person's body. So the father's sperm were made up of little pieces from his body, and the egg from the mother was made up of little pieces of her body. And so that when the egg and sperm came together, you got a blending of the little tiny gemmules, these little pieces of the two parents. So that children were supposed to be kind of this exact kind of combination of both parents. Now, that's not, totally different than how we see it genetics, but it actually changes things quite a bit if you don't understand about chromosomes, which they didn't in those days. So blending inheritance it was the typical belief at the time. And Mendel, in his experiments, what he discovered is that that was not actually how it seemed to work. That he suggested inheritance was actually particulate. Individual traits, he said, are determined by some kind of a determining factor, some kind of particle that determined the phenotype. And by the way, the picture here at the bottom, you can see I kind of identified Mendel there. He's standing up in the back row, third one from the right, and he is holding a plant in his hands. So kind of in character there with the stuff that he was studying. Well, here's what Mendel did then. He went to pea plants and he said, well, let me use these plants to figure out how traits are inherited. And he studied 7 different traits in pea plants. And I could spend a lot of time talking about Mendel's experiments. They're really fascinating. And his choice of traits was actually serendipitous. Many of the famous scientific discoveries had a part of that too, that he was just lucky. He picked the right kind of traits. He could have picked some that would have really screwed up his research, but these ones worked quite well. And he did very careful experiments. He knew that pea plants, if you leave them to themselves, they most typically will self-fertilize. The flowers are kind of closed up, and it's hard for another flower to get into the flower of another one. But he also knew that if he cut the stamens off, they couldn't self-fertilize, and thus he could guarantee cross-fertilization. So you can see here on the right, this process. You cut the stamens off of the purple flower there, and then you can take pollen from this white flower and dust it onto the stigma of the purple flower. And so now we have a what he called a hybrid, a hybridization event. You're hybridizing 2 varieties of pea plants, a purple flowered and a white flowered. And he then grew the peas from that cross, and lo and behold, all of the offspring were purple. Now, this result, of course, could still be kind of like blending inheritance, because purple and white, yeah, it gives you purple, right? Because white isn't a color, so you just get purple offspring. And if Mendel had stopped there, he might never have gone on to his full discovery. And so let me show you what he did. He continued and took those ones, and in this figure, they're called the F1 generation. So that's your first offspring from this hybrid cross. He took those and he allowed them to self-fertilize. He also did some cross-fertilizations among the purple offspring. So he tried both things. And what he found, and it was a very simple process, this is called a monohybrid cross, very, very easy to do. And what he discovered was that in the next generation, the white ones showed up again. And this is where Mendel's genius comes to the surface, because he realized, oh, look it can't be blending inheritance, because otherwise, where did those white flowered pea plants come from? They just, they just appeared out of those purple plants out of nowhere. And so he suggested that there were actually determining particles that determine the phenotype. The phenotype is that physical characteristic of purple and white. And he said those particles were the determining factors. And here's how those particles work. This is a little more complex diagram, but I just look at the right. We've got letters to stand for 2 different particles. And he did the very same thing. So purple was given a capital P letter, and white was given a lowercase p. And he said that the lowercase p particles, the white particles, were recessive to the dominant purple particles. And so purple flowers always occurred if you had at least one purple particle. Okay. Now, today we call these genes, or alleles, as to be more precise as a biologist, but they were particles that determined the outcome. And then when you take those purple ones, now the purple pea flowers can produce gametes, the sperm and the egg, that have either a purple particle or a white particle, and then they come together randomly, and some of the offspring end up white. Now, with my students, of course, we would learn the ratios and all that, and I don't need you to do that, but you can see how the genes here, these particles that he didn't know were genes, but the genes are what determine the outcomes of these different crosses. So this is the first inkling that there were some sort of physical particles that determined the genetic characteristics that were passed on from parents to children. And this works not just in plants, it works in humans. And here's a fun one that I think would be helpful for everybody to know about if you didn't already. Our blood type, the simple ABO blood type system, is a very straightforward, very simple genetic trait. It involves a single gene with different forms. And you can see here the different forms are the A form, and you've heard of A-type blood, the B form, and what's called O. O means that those little particles, you can see them on the outside of the blood cells there. Those are antigens. This is an antigen system, and the genes determine which antigens your red blood cells have. Somebody who is type O is simply not making any antigens of the AB type. They're just not there. And so we have been able to explain all kinds of human traits using the very simple Mendelian sort of approach. Now, one thing that you need to be careful about is that the Mendelian genetic inheritance idea implies that if you get a gene, you get a specific outcome. You get this allele, you get this result. That's just the way it is. It always comes out that way. And for things like blood type, for flower color, and so on, that's the way it works. Even for eye color. And here's a little more complex trait now. Here's eye color. Eye color, we know now, is controlled by 16 different genes. Okay. But it turns out that there's about 2 genes out of those 16 that are responsible for most of the differences in eye color. And here on the left, we see what happens when people with different eye colors, parents with different eye colors, come together and have children. And there's different probabilities of having children of the different eye colors depending on the parents. Now, the reason those probabilities are there is because we may not know what actual genes the parent has. If a person has brown eyes, they may have one gene for brown color eye, or one allele for brown color, and one for blue. The blue is hidden because it's recessive to brown. And so when you have 2 parents up there at the top who both have brown eyes, they generally have brown-eyed children. They may have some green-eyed ones. There's another gene involved there. And they may have some blue-eyed ones if both parents are heterozygous. They each have one brown and one blue allele. So you can see how this is getting more complicated, but it's still, once you understand genetics, you can explain it pretty straightforwardly. And my students learn this, and they understand how these kinds of traits are passed on. And it's just amazing that we have been able to come to the point where we can follow this through. But as I said, this is a Mendelian trait. It is something that always gives a specific outcome. If you get the specific genes, you get a specific outcome. It's always that way. And that gives a mistaken impression. Genes don't determine every single trait completely. Many traits also involve environmental effects. And so we have to also take that into account, just so you know. And so here's one where environmental effects actually also are involved. Now, this is skin color. Skin color, we know, is due to 3 different genes that all work together. And depending on the combination of alleles that you get different skin colors. And you can see here that just from these 3 genes that involve skin color, you get 6 at the bottom there. You can see 6 different skin colors. But we actually get more than that. So notice my important note there. Important note, environment also affects the shade of skin color, how much sun you're exposed to. There are other genes also that can modify or a little bit what these genes are doing. And so there's more to it than just these 3, but we can explain it to a great degree by looking at those 3 genes and then realizing that environment also is going to play a part. And so one of the longstanding issues in the 20th century in genetics has been the nature-nurture issue. How much of me is my genes, and how much of me is the result of the environment that I'm growing in, that I grew up in? How much is due to my parents' training? How much is due to the cultural setting in which I grew up? And I'll say we continue to argue about those things. Okay, so we're not settled on that. We know that genetics has a big influence, but so does environment. The question becomes how much of each, and if in fact genetics has a significant contribution, how does that affect my ability to make decisions in life and have a free will? So that brings us now to the very more complex, the traits we still don't fully understand. Many traits in humans are considerably more complicated than simple Mendelian traits. I can't just say, oh, yeah, here's this 3 genes and they control this whole stuff. Not even possible. Multifactorial traits are controlled by many genes and are also affected by environmental factors. So there's a complex interplay among numerous genes and lots of different environmental factors. We can think of a whole list of these. I've given you a short list here. Height, heart disease, whether a person has a tendency to develop heart disease. Um, we have genes we can show increase a person's probability of having heart disease. Hypercholesterolemia being one example. Someone with that is going to be more prone to heart disease. Now, can you change that? Of course, you can exercise more, you can eat differently, you can maybe even take some medications. So there are environmental effects on heart disease too. Both of those play a part. Addiction and mental health issues. And we know there's heavy genetic loadings on these, but there's also environmental effects. Now, to try and determine to what degree such traits are genetic, we do what's called heritability studies. Now, these are really fascinating. Heritability studies, the ones that give us the most precise data, come from what are called twin studies. It's where they will take twins that have been separated from birth and look at the expression of their traits. The assumption is, of course, monozygotic twins, identical twins, are close to being genetic clones. They have almost exactly the same genes. Now, there will be some mutations during their development that might make them differ slightly from each other, but by and large, they're very similar. And we've all known of twins that we've met that seem like, wow, they really do have similarities. And there's been many stories of twins separated at birth that later met and discovered, oh my goodness, we both have the same kind of profession. We have the same kind of foods we like. We, have the same sort of funny vocal habits or little tics, all kinds of stuff that shows, wow, we're just so similar. So, these twins are really a key to trying to figure out how much of a trait is due to genetics and how much is maybe due to the environment. And so what we do in these twin studies is we take them, and they must be separated at birth, by the way, because you want to randomize the environment. You don't want them to be living in the same environment, because living in the same environment also would tend to give the same similar outcomes. So you want these twins to have been separated at birth and raised by totally different families. Now, that doesn't solve it completely, because they might be growing up in similar, let's say, socioeconomic settings to each other and other things. So you want a large sample so that hopefully those cases where twins were in fact raised in somewhat similar environments, you still have a large enough sample that you can get a bigger picture, and it's a little more randomized. And so the reason for that is, and I give it more in technical terms in parentheses there's covariance between genetics and environment. In other words, the two of them affect each other. Now, monozygotic twins are assumed to be almost genetically identical, so that's the key here. If we wanted to really do perfect studies, we would just make some clones and then give them out to different families. But obviously, couldn't do that. That's not ethical. But these twins kind of provide a natural source of this information. So the phenotypic differences, those trait differences between those twins, then we would attribute to environmental effects, and those things that they're similar in would be probably primarily due to their genetics. Now, this is getting now to the heart of this, and this is the tough part. I don't know how much, I can make this really clear, and it is really hard to understand what is heritability actually telling me. On the left, what does it mean? Well, heritability is the part of a population's, now notice population, heritability numbers are actually about the population, not about individual pairs of people. So that can be a little bit, difficult to comprehend, but we're talking about the tendency of a population because of the genetic effects that we know about. So heritability is a part of the part of the population's phenotypic variation that is attributed to genetic variation. Okay, so it's not the trait itself, but it's the variation around that trait that we are explaining using heritability. Okay. Secondly, heritability values only have meaning for the population in which it is measured. So you could measure it in Europeans, and it may not be quite the same as if you measured it in Americans or in some other smaller group somewhere else. And so the results are not necessarily universally applicable. Now, I have to say that they're often fairly similar. because human populations are not as different from one another as you might think. So it's not terrible if you think, oh, I learned about this group here and it can generalize. You can generalize a little bit, but you got to be careful because it means it's results for that population only. And then lastly, this is really important. High values do not mean that environment has no effect. This was especially evident in the area in the early 20th century. There were studies of IQ. And early on, it was found that IQ had a really high 90% plus heritability, were the values that were coming out of that. And so the conclusion was people are born with this IQ and there's not much you can do to change it. So why should we spend money on education for underprivileged kids, for example, because it's not going to make much difference? Turns out that's not true. If you actually do give good education, good preschool education, good other kinds of learning opportunities, and good schooling, actually IQ does shift. So just because it has a high heritability doesn't mean the environment has no effect, and you can change it. It just means that, well, genetics have a high influence. Okay, so you got to be careful that you don't take those numbers to mean that environment does nothing. It actually can have a significant effect. Now, on the right, what does heritability not mean? Okay, it's not the proportion of an individual's phenotype that is due to genetics. So if I say 80%, it doesn't mean that 80% of that person's characteristic in that regard is due to genetics. It tells me that a high amount of genetic influence is present, yes, but I don't know how much. I can't really pinpoint the number, but I know that it's highly influential. So I know that sort of maybe is disappointing, but the number doesn't have a very strict application in terms of that's how much of the phenotype is produced by it. Secondly, heritability is not the same in two populations, even if they are genetically similar. So again, we have to remind ourselves it's not applicable just across the board. And lastly, high values do not mean a trait is all genetic and unaffected by environment. Again, the IQ story, got to remember that. It does, education does change a person's IQ. It's not just an inborn trait completely. Those things change. Of course, it's because of the way we measure IQ more than anything else, probably. Okay, so having said all that, let's now take a look at some numbers. Here are some heritabilities. And these are for a variety of traits. You can see at the top, one of our highest heritabilities is height. Too surprising. You have two tall parents. They typically have tall children. Not a surprise there. There's a lot of genetic influence on height. Now, does that mean 88% of a person's height is due to genes? No, again, remember, that's not a strict value there. It's just telling us that there's a lot of genetic influence on that trait. And in fact, if you had a child who was not fed well and had other environmental impacts that kept them from growing to their full height, it doesn't matter if they have a high amount of genetic loading for that. It doesn't mean they'll be tall. Going on down the list there, you see there's IQ in there. People still have continued to test that in spite of some of its problems. And then we get into our personality. This is fascinating and you'll notice that most personality traits tend to run close to 45 to 50% heritability. Well, that means that the genes have a strong influence, but environment has a pretty strong influence too. The two interact extensively for these things. Not too much of a surprise. People's personalities are affected by how they're raised, of course, but they also are affected by the genes. Psychiatric disorders. Notice autism, 90%. This should be a reminder that autism is not primarily an environmentally caused disease. When you get a value that high, it doesn't mean environment has no effect, as I want to remind you of that, but it does mean that often we're going to find genes that are tightly tied to that characteristic, and they are finding a lot of those, by the way. Major depression, 80%. Wow. Schizophrenia, 80%. And that's not too much of a surprise either for those of you that maybe are psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers. When you have somebody with schizophrenia, guess what? It kind of runs in their family because it has a very strong genetic loading. Even alcoholism down there. And now down to some interesting stuff that has been studied in more recent times, religiosity. Yeah, it has a 30 to 45% heritability. Conservatism, 45 to 65%. Views on school, yeah, interesting, 41%. Views on pacifism, 38%. So again, we are seeing some genetic influences there. People are not religious because they chose to be necessarily. Some people just happen to have greater religiosity than other people do. And I think most of us have figured that out over time, that really does appear to be the case. Now, these numbers are from before 2015. They're mostly in the early 2000s. I'm going to give some more recent numbers a little later here on some of these things that are more interesting, I think. But I wanted to focus on one of those traits and show you some of the real technical literature. I'll simplify this. I'll bring it down as far as I can. This is schizophrenia. Schizophrenia has long been known to have a very strong genetic loading, and psychologists would love to know, and neuropsychologists would love to know, well, what's driving this? What are the genes involved? And so here is a plot. Now, this is a plot from a thing called genome-wide association analysis, or genome-wide association study, called GWAS for short. And that's a complicated term for what's going on here. What they do is they take the DNA sequence of a whole bunch of different people. Or it may not be just the sequence, it might be individual parts of that sequence, but they take it and they take and ask the question, how many people with schizophrenia have a particular genetic, a particular sequence in their DNA that is not found in people that don't have schizophrenia? And so they look across a large population of individuals. They take a large sample size. You can see this one here is altogether over, let's see, it's about almost 80,000 individuals. It's 79,000 something there that they sampled. So a really large sample size. And 34,000 people or so there that have schizophrenia compared to 45,000 people that don't. And then you just plot all this, and then through some complex statistics that I won't even pretend to describe to you, they develop a statistical measure that says if you find that these traits are correlated more than a certain amount, and you can see this red line in this figure here. See if I can get my pointer working here. I didn't have it up. So down here, you can see this red line that goes across. Any of these genetic sequences that end up above that line potentially have some involvement in the development of schizophrenia. Now, you can see there's a lot of those, right? There's a bunch. In fact, they give it in the top here. It's 108 genetic loci, they call them. 108. So, and that's probably not even all the genes that are involved in schizophrenia, but it's at least a start to figure it out. Now, this though is just a start, because here's what those blips on this set of blips here are specifically, I believe this one is all SNPs, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. Here it is, in fact. There are two types of things that they look for these, quotes, genes that might cause schizophrenia or anything else that you're studying. One of them is SNPs. SNPs are just changes in the letters in the gene of the associated part of the DNA. And so you can see here that in our people with schizophrenia, maybe they have a G here, and the reference genome, people that don't have schizophrenia have a T. And so that's one of the differences that we see maybe. That's called an SNP. It's a single nucleotide difference. And the P part is polymorphism, meaning it varies across the population. And so these people with schizophrenia have one that people that don't have it don't have. And so this potentially represents a genetic change that may be involved in the development of schizophrenia. Now, there's another set of traits they look at too called copy number variation. And that is where they look for parts of the genome, parts of the DNA, where there's a piece that is missing in people with schizophrenia. So here's a piece that's found in people that don't have it, and then it's missing in people with schizophrenia. Or a piece that's found in normal individuals where it's duplicated in people with schizophrenia. Okay, so these are other things they will focus in on. And as they begin looking at those, then the next question is, okay, so we found all these these genes, these loci, what do they mean? Well, sometimes we have no idea. There's some point in the DNA, we don't know what they do. So we start analyzing, what are they? Are they genes? Are they something going on? And so here's a much more complicated table. I'm going to simplify down on this too. Notice on the left, locus means the location. And you'll see the first number on each one of these is a number, a single number, 1 through 22. That's the chromosome. So it just tells you which chromosome each of these things is on. And these are some of these copy number variants. So the deletions or the duplications that occur. And those are pretty large sometimes. So this one here, for example, this one is a chromosome deletion. That's what DEL stands for. And it knocks out 13 genes. So there's 13 genes potentially in that little section of DNA. It could be any one of those genes or more than one that's involved in schizophrenia. So now what they're going to do is they're going to go and analyze those genes. What do those genes do? You can see how complicated it's getting. This over here gives us an idea. Okay, this is the number of individuals with schizophrenia that have that deletion. It's 17%. Oh, actually, I'm sorry, 0.17%. So it isn't percent. So 0.17%. Compared to people that don't have schizophrenia, it's 0.021. So there's a lot more likelihood to find this deletion in people with schizophrenia than in people without it. Now you're beginning to see the complexity here because it's not that people with schizophrenia have something that other people don't, it's that they have it more often. And they may have a whole collection of them that all together bring about schizophrenia. But how? And we may not know. So it's really, really difficult to know exactly, based on this kind of information, yet what's causing it. But, okay, here's the take home. So what have we learned about schizophrenia from all this complex genetics? Well, even for a trait with very high heritability, which schizophrenia is, we now know there are many genes associated with the possession of the trait. In fact, they also know that of these many genes, some of them may contribute very little, but they contribute something. We just don't know what. Now, no one who has schizophrenia has all the genes associated with schizophrenia. This complicates our understanding of things then. So, okay, some of them are there in people with schizophrenia, some aren't. Sometimes some people have it, some don't. But we start seeing patterns eventually. And it's starting to come together, but we still don't have a good understanding of the genetic causes yet. Now, some of the genes associated with schizophrenia also are found in people who do not have it. So that's puzzling. Why is it not causing problems for them? Well, it's maybe because it's the combination of all those genes together. And then the reminder that each gene explains only a small amount of the variation in the expression of schizophrenia. So we're talking about variation here. It's not even necessarily a direct cause, but it's something that helps explain people that have versus don't have it. And eventually, as we hone in on this, we may get to the point where we pick out individual genes and say, oh, this gene does this. And if I develop a drug, it might be able to change that. But now remember, just a reminder, even with high heritability, environment also affects the occurrence of schizophrenia. We know people that develop schizophrenia, nobody in their family has it. Where'd it come from? Might have been, environmental effects of childhood. Very, very, maybe very traumatic childhoods could cause schizophrenia. Drug exposure potentially causes schizophrenia. So there certainly are environmental effects can also drive it. And when you have the genetic loading along with environment, that's why people in families where the genes are there, they tend to get it more often because the environmental effects are much more easily affect their brains. So the conclusion is we know genes have a lot to do with developing schizophrenia. We know that they do. We just don't know what the genes are, which ones do it. And the ones we have discovered, we don't know what they actually do themselves. So it's really an ongoing set of work. Now, back to heritability again. I told you I would bring up some more recent numbers. Most of these are from the 2020s and more recent. And these are maybe traits that might be of more interest to some of you. For example, cessation of prayer. People decide, I'm not going to pray anymore. And they've done a study on that, 34% heritability. Religious disaffiliation, people that leave religion, 75% heritability. If you believe that being a member of a religious community is what saves you, and that has that high of a heritability. Is it fair for people that have the genetic loading for religious disaffiliation? Would that be fair that they are treated as, outcasts because they just can't seem to be a part of that community? Interesting thought. Religiosity, 30 to 45, that's been fairly stable. You remember the other numbers I'd shown earlier, similar to the numbers to that. And then I've got a set here of what are called primal beliefs. These are things that are at the very basis of what people think about the world, such as the world is a good place. Okay, I mean, people have each of us usually has some degree of agreement with that or disagreement with it. The world's a good place, shows 37% heritability. The world needs me. I'm important to the world, 42%. The world is meaningful, 36%. You can see how these are all hovering between 35 and 40-ish in their percent heritability. Strength of partisan attachment, about 50%. And then if we broaden that to a little bit more, it's including partisanship, but social coherence and what you belong to, 40 to 60%. There's a number of studies that show that level of genetic influence there. Adult picky eating. Ever wondered about the people that are picky eaters? Sometimes we make moral judgments about them. No, they just need to learn to eat everything what's put in front of them, and parents try to teach their kids that. Well, you know what? Maybe there's some genetics behind that, and there is some evidence for that in terms of this relatively high heritability there, 49%. Pescatarianism, eating fish as in your diet, 74%, and vegetarianism, 77. Well, so Adventists, hey, well, maybe Adventists are vegetarians because their genetic heritage is that. I don't know. Some people at least. So anyway, these are some things to think about. Then, what about these heritabilities? What do they mean for us in terms of our relationship to one another and our relationship to the church? And so, I wanted to now, for the rest of this lesson, I'm not going to tell you answers because I don't have the answers. I wanted to open it up for a lot of questions, and so I'm going to go through some questions here, kind of wrapping it up, and then we'll see if some of you can help with the process of kind of figuring out what do we do with this. So first of all, are we predestined? Well, I would say that based on what we know from modern genetics, we're not predestined. So that's good news, I suppose. But it doesn't mean we're completely free either. It might be more appropriate to say we're preconditioned. So you are preconditioned genetically for certain kinds of ways that you're going to respond to the world and maybe to God as well. For example, the brain characteristics that are prone to develop into schizophrenia are likely to be inherited from parents with that condition. So you may inherit it from a parent who has schizophrenia, but remember, schizophrenia has environmental components too. So it doesn't mean you will get it, but you have a much higher likelihood of developing it. Now, as psychiatrists and neurophysiologists learn more about what causes schizophrenia, some of those environmental effects may potentially be avoided. And that's the hope, of course. We figure out what all those things are. And if we understand the genetics better, we might even be able to counteract some of the genes influence themselves. If we can figure out drugs that counteract the product of that gene, for example, that is a part of the cause of schizophrenia. So thus, children of someone with schizophrenia are not predestined to have schizophrenia. However, they do have a greater probability of developing it because they have genes that make them prone to develop it. So we got to remember that. So what does this mean then? What about partisanship? What about spirituality? Partisanship I bring up because these days it seems like we have a little bit of partisanship going on in our country. I know I'm kind of downplaying that, right? Well, many people have family members or friends who are rabid partisans. Those kind of people that you just really don't enjoy being around because they don't agree with you at all. They're totally opposed to you. They're on the opposite side. Well, does knowing that a significant reason they are that way is likely based on genetics, does that change how we should approach them? In other words, no one chooses their genetics. So to some degree, people cannot help which party they belong to. They're Republican or they're Democrat because they have the genes that have kind of predisposed them, at least preconditioned them to fall right into that. Can this help us be more understanding of people who are in the opposing party? I'll have to admit, I have a hard time being understanding of people that are rabid partisans, but could knowing that they're not completely responsible for the way that they view the political situation, could that help me to be more compassionate towards them and maybe even open up a potential dialogue with them? Well, I'm hoping. Now, if the ability to have spiritual experiences is determined in a significant way by genetics, how does that suggest we should treat the weaker members of our church, or unbelievers, or apostates, those people who have left? Did they leave because they of free will, or was there something about their inability to connect God that led to that? And then the deeper questions, and this is my last slide, and after that I'm going to open it up to have some discussion. Yeah. So deeper questions. Given that genetics influences so many things about being human, how responsible should people be held for their negative actions? This is a big question. And I think it's one that, and my next question there, should criminals be punished or rehabilitated? That's where we get to that, trying to answer that question. If somebody commits a crime, we all feel like they just need to be punished. Treat them, give them a lesson there. That'll change them. But would it be maybe more appropriate to rehabilitate them, to bring up to bear the environmental conditions that might actually counteract the genetic loading that person may have? Or do we have to have some combination of both? Clearly, I mean, I think people maybe should be held somewhat responsible, of course, but to what degree? And then the biggest question of all, how can God judge a person who has a strong genetic loading for inability to have spiritual feelings or exercise faith? Will such a person be lost because they can't believe God exists? How can God be fair to such individuals? I think this goes right to the heart of our great controversy view of our great controversy worldview, that people are confronted with the truth, they analyze it carefully, and they realize, yes, God is right, I'm going to follow him, and thus they become saved. I mean, that sounds all great, but what if that isn't completely a free will choice on their part? They're not able to actually bring free will to bear. How does God judge drug addicts or deeply mentally ill people who may have no capacity to connect with God? What happens to those people? And I've always wondered about that. I mean, does God just condemn them? Can he be fair to them? What would he do to be fair to them? So those are my questions. And I'm going to turn off my presentation here and come back and hope to get some discussion going. Oh, yes. And by the way, I did ask my wife, Judy, if she would help with my presentation. She's sort of hemmed and hawed, but she has a comment. So I have the right, I think, here of letting her comment first. So I'm going to let her say something. Here you go, Judy.
Am I on?
Yeah, here.
I just wanted to make the comment, which may make this more complicated, because as a therapist, psychologists and therapists are starting to understand a little bit more, although just a little bit, about how trauma can impact people's DNA and impact genetics, well, what we might call epigenetics, which Bryan didn't go into as much. But I think that also needs to help us with our understanding of the kind of behaviors that we see, that there may be things that are trauma related that we don't understand how that affects them and may actually impact their ability to choose healthy behaviors because they're less able to.
Yeah, and lest it seem like epigenetic changes are lesser than, let's say, genetic coding itself, they actually can be just as permanent. So, once an epigenetic change has occurred, I mean, it's in your genes now. So it didn't change the gene's coding, but it changes the way the gene gets expressed, and that can have just as much effect as knocking an entire gene out or something. So we shouldn't downplay the potential, as Judy says, of trauma. And that's an environmental effect, by the way, that leads to a genetic effect, interestingly enough. So anyway, thank you. That's why I'd asked her to help me out here. I thought I should have had her more involved with this.
You did great.
All right. Yes, thank you so much, Bryan, and thank you so much to your lovely wife for contributing to your presentation. I think you've done a good job. We still have more than 110 people online, so I don't think you lost anyone with the science, but definitely very interesting, your approach. And just a reminder, for those who are unsure what's happening now, we're going to be having the discussion, so you can raise your electronic hand. Usually somewhere to the bottom right of your screen, you'll see the option to raise your hand so you can join the conversation, and then we'll allow you to unmute in that order. And Dr. Johnson, I see you are already unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. I'm grateful to Mrs. Ness for bringing up the issue of epigenetics. This can be the result not only of trauma, but also of choice. I can have not inherited alcoholism, but for some reason, maybe social pressure or something, if I get into binge drinking, my descendants can become alcoholism. I don't know if you'd call that trauma, but perhaps in some sense, choice is playing a role there too. So this question of epigenetics needs to be explored a lot. And in Exodus 20, verse 5, and right in the Ten Commandments, you actually find epigenetics, don't you? Because it says that he visits the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and the fourth generation and so forth. Sounds like epigenetics to me. One last question, so I don't have to do another one. Have you had any conversation with Rick Rice?
No, I have not, but I did want to comment on your epigenetic one really quick. And if you had more about Rick Rice, say it in a moment here. They've studied, the little roundworms, the Cenorhabditis elegans. It's the little roundworms they study in the lab to study all kinds of genetic questions. And one of them they studied is epigenetics on those. And they've discovered that epigenetic changes can persist in Cenorhabditis elegans up to about 20 or even maybe more generations.
Wow.
So, what Exodus says under the fourth and fifth generation, maybe it could even be worse than that in terms of how long it persists.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you use the word persist. Does it eventually fade away, or do you have to have another trauma or something happen?
Well, those kinds of epigenetic changes have a tendency to erode over time. So, physically what they are, what epigenetic changes of that kind are usually methylation is the most common one. There's a methyl group added to some of the bases in the DNA, and it's not a faithful copying process. So over time, some of those disappear. They just don't get transmitted. And so it does erode. And if it's not reinforced, it tends to erode too. So you can kind of think of it in some ways, maybe like habit to a degree, that if it's not if you don't participate in, say, drinking on a regular basis, those epigenetic markers in the next generation will probably get lighter as time goes on.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, thank you so much. Lauren, you are next. Please go ahead and join the conversation.
A fascinating conversation. Thanks so much, Bryan. I just want to start by saying I have, for my own purposes, set aside or at least explained or decided not to try to explain the question of what God's going to do in judgment. My belief has to be that God is going to understand all of this stuff. And if God is not good, then I don't want to be in heaven with God, with a God that isn't good anyway. So I'm very sad when people say to me, I've had some very wonderful Adventist friends who've said to me, unfortunately, my son is not going to be in heaven with me because he rejected the church. And you can try to say, no, I don't think that's true. I think God understands where your son is coming from. But that's a very deeply rooted understanding that black and white, my son isn't a Seventh Adventist, so he won't be in heaven with me. That breaks my heart. But the real thing I want to say is how powerful this inheritance thing is. You know, I've known people that had the precise, I had a friend who had the precise walk, the gait of his father. Could he have picked it up and said, that's the way dad walks? Maybe, but his brother didn't have it. He had it. So I just to note how nuanced, how subtle, such subtle things can be pushed through. And that has to be true in the way we relate to God too. When I was a younger pastor, this was the era of the when vineyards started getting popular, and I tried so hard to set up a rock band and raise my hands to Jesus, and I really wanted to do that, Bryan, because it seemed like the thing to do, and they seemed to be happy doing it. And the fact of the matter is, I am terminally cognitive. You know, I'm not going to let go and just, whoa, wow, Jesus, I feel so good. I'm happy. I'm crying. I'm laughing. I'm never going to be that person. And I
You're not going
tried
to
to be
speak
that
tongues
person,
either,
and I
apparently. Huh?
tried to lead my congregation to be like that. And some of them got into it, but a lot of them were just like, oh, no, that's not where I'm at. So how powerful this is to this day. I mean, it took me years to come to terms with the fact that my brain was not going to work that way. I was not going to be the guy in the vineyard service jumping up and down for Jesus. So and yet a really well-crafted prayer from the Book of Common Prayer can be very touching to me. And so can great poems and things like that, but it's got to be mediated cognitively some way. If you start thinking about that, Seventh-day Adventism, this goes back to the first thing I said, Seventh-day Adventists seem to be best if they have a very distinct black and white understanding of what's right and what's wrong. The best Seventh-day Adventists, you know, if we're going to take, let's say, Elder Wilson as a model, have a very distinctive understanding of that this is right and this is wrong, this is black and this is white. And so the people in my congregation who are more gray in their ability to say, oh, maybe that's true, maybe it's not true, I can live in the gray area, never quite fit in quite as well. And then you add that here's a pastor who likes to, you know, wander about in the gray area and not black and white. It can be very hard. So folks, take courage. What I always say about Adventists today generally, and about my ministry, is I want people to look at the spiritual options and find the place in their the kind of spirituality that works for them, throw out what doesn't work, keep what does work. And I hope in the end, we all end up feeling that some of the things that we got from our Adventist upbringing were very valuable to us. I certainly do, but not all of it. And that would bother Elder Wilson a great deal if I, you know, that's not where he's at. It's got to be all valuable. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah, no, as I say, Lauren, the maybe that speaks to the part about the potter and the clay where Paul talks about it. Maybe we need to recognize, yeah, you know, my pot's not your pot, and it may be different. And I think recognizing, to me, that the church would, if they would, this is where, for me at least, the idea of our genetics driving a lot of this, at least in part, should help us to be more compassionate with those who can't think like we do. It should.
Precisely. And please, if anybody comes to you and says so and so isn't going to be in heaven, just reject that whole. I hate that kind of thinking. It is so damaging, so harmful. That is not up for us to decide. In fact, if God is good, probably God is going to save more of us than not. That's how the only way I can want to be in heaven with God.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that.
All right. Thank you so much, Lauren. And now we invite Pastor Tanisha to join the conversation. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Sissy. Bryan and Judy, thank you for this presentation. I actually raised my hand to ask about epigenetics, but then you got a little into epigenetics. But my therapist brain too was clicking into what is the role of trauma, choice, environment, habits in activating some of these genetic predispositions that we're loaded with. But I have two questions for you, Bryan. One is you mentioned in your response to Dr. Johnson about habitual choice. Kind of, I guess I wouldn't say, I guess you didn't say deactivating, but impacting the extent to which certain genetic traits show up in successive generations. But what kind of impact would it have for us currently? So if I'm genetically predisposed to certain types of behaviors or thought processes, what kind of a uphill battle am I looking at to make the right choice, from a genetic standpoint? That's my first question. And then, my second question is, as a church, how would you recommend that we adjust our ministry and outreach and how we approach people? I didn't realize that genetics can impact things, down to how conservative you are or your tendency to leave the church. These for me were all a matter of choice. I never made the connection that these things, you could be more genetically inclined to make those kinds of choices. So what recommendations do you have for how we should adjust our approach to people with those things in mind?
Yeah, your second question is a tough one, but I'll go with the first one for a second. Because, of course, one of the other issues around this, and I didn't cover this today, is there's a psychological question of whether we have free will. When I make a decision about something, have I truly thought it through and decided, yes, I'm going to make this choice? Or is that choice somehow made at some other level? And right now, the current research suggests that most of our choices are made at a subconscious level before we've even thought about it, which suggests to me that habit is what drives, I suspect, drives the unconscious or the subconscious, so that it truly is, and that's maybe why it's hard to change habits too, is you have to do it enough so that your subconscious picks up on that and is able to then respond the way you really want to. So I'm not with the psychologists say we have no free will, but I do think that our free will is many times a bit elusive, because we so often we're going to make choices based on maybe genetic loading, as well as based on past environmental inputs, and especially if those were traumatic sources of information in our lives, those might drive those bad decisions at the subconscious level. So I think therapy is very important, because I live with a therapist, but I think in changing the way that we interact, I think, with our unconscious and subconscious. I mean, we've got to somehow retrain that.
Wonder for a second.
So the second question is an interesting one. Our church has had one approach, right, to evangelism primarily, and that is you share the prophetic truths that our church was founded on. You get buy-in to the truths that those represent. The person decides, yes, I'm going to keep the Sabbath. That's the seal of God. Now I'm going to go to heaven, and that's been our approach. And of course, that really works best for a conservative kind of mind. And so I guess maybe your question is, well, what about those people that aren't like that? I mean, what do we do? And for me, I think we need to maybe get less emphasis on the head part of that and say, this is a more, and I've seen people doing this, that we are more as a group getting together to mutually support one another in our spiritual path, whatever that may be, and not be so much into forcing people into this same mold of I have to believe this, when in fact some people may never be able to actually believe some of those things. But does that mean God leaves them out? I hope not. As Lauren even pointed out, I don't think God's going to say, "Oh, did you keep the Sabbath after you knew that the Sabbath needed to be kept?" I don't. What if a person can't make that kind of decision because of the way the brains that they've been given? So I think loosening up, and my wife, yeah, Judy wanted to say something too. So let me give her.
I just wanted to trigger the therapy part of me because that's an excellent question, and I think more and more therapists and social workers are kind of grappling with this understanding. And so, in the past 10 years or so, I found myself more and more thinking of things, behaviors, and issues not as good, bad, right, wrong, or you belong or you don't belong, but more healthy, unhealthy. And so I tell clients all the time, I'm really into you being alive and safe and healthy. Let's talk about what might be healthier for you and how to make choices in that direction rather than judging something as good or bad, right or wrong, because for them, they might not feel like they had that much choice in how they got in this predicament. And so, therapists, I think there is this model of abstinence only when you're dealing with habit change. You just have to go cold turkey and do the new thing and not do the old thing. But I think more and more therapists are working with harm reduction, we call it, where let's see if we can help people move into something healthier, safer, which also can have epigenetic effects, as like Bryan was saying, they start to learn new habits. So it's kind of like if you start a new diet rather than doing the whole thing Monday morning, you start with, I'm going to drink more water, or I'm going to eat a good, healthy oatmeal breakfast. You start with one thing and build that habit, and it helps you start making choices in a healthy direction.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I really like that. I had a thought as you were speaking, Judy, how powerful it would be if our seminarians, as part of our preparation for ministry, if we were taught to think like this and approach pastoral ministry with a congregation from that perspective of strengthening character through harm reduction and making healthy choices rather than just affirming theology. It'd be a really interesting approach to ministry. Thank you so much for that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, and thank you to Tanisha for asking that. And as you were wrapping up that conversation, I was just thinking about this kind of new start, kind of a template that we have that has lots of suggestions on how to live a healthy life. But that's not the focus oftentimes of our ministry. But that's for another conversation. Linda, you are next in line. Please go ahead and join the conversation.
Before she starts, Sherry, I just wanted to mention my wife's going to have to leave here shortly. So if anybody wants to ask her anything, better do it soon because she has to run and get my mom bring her home for lunch.
Okay, so if any of you have a question for Judy, just put it in the chat so that I can kind of move you up so you can ask your question before she leaves. All right, Linda, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bryan. I'm going to have to find this on YouTube and look at it again. I have an interesting story for you. I'm one of 8 children, 3 girls and 5 boys. All have the same parents, raised, I'm Black, African American. All of us raised mother and father, dad in the home up until, I got to be a teenager. But 3 of us, 2 of my brothers and myself, are very dark skinned, and I love my skin. I love my skin color. Don't have, but my other 5, which is 3 sisters and 2 brothers, they're about maybe a shade darker than you, which makes them very, 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 very fair skin. Okay, the thing is, my eyes are blue. Now I have real dark skin. Yeah, that's the reaction I get, and it kind of makes me angry a lot of times, but I'm getting used to it. When I go to my doctor, which is like maybe once or twice a year, when I first started going, and he just made that, and especially during COVID when we had to wear the mask, and he could really focus on my eyes, he just made here's this very, very dark-skinned woman with bright blue eyes with green specks in it. And I get this from white people. The Black people will ask me, am I wearing contact lens? Because, we do things, we can do things with our hair being blonde sometimes. We go through all kinds of phases. We wear, some of us have worn contact lens. No, I'm not wearing contact lens. Well, your eyes are blue. Yeah, even my daughter. I got 2 daughters. Mom, your eyes are blue. My youngest son, is it the sun shining on your eyes, Mom, that make them blue? They are very light-skinned. I said, is God playing a trick? He's giving me kids that are little darker than you are, Bryan. And I know you're white, but my kids are Black. His dad and me are both Black. His dad, is real light skinned. And I'm like, but it really irritated me. The second was a specialist I went to because I was having some knee problems at one time. I went to a chiropractor, and it was so I finally asked the eye doctor, is there something wrong with my eyes? I've had these eyes for yay number of years. No, nothing's wrong with your eyes. I said, well, they're blue. So I said, I'm brown, dark skin. Do you have a problem with that? I said, no. I said, they're beautiful, but other people have that. And it's an unconscious bias. If I were white, they would not have a problem with that. So thank you for letting me rant, but I just had to get that out.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because eye color and skin color actually aren't correlated. The only reason that most Black people have brown eyes is because of the history of the population. But there's blue genes running throughout everybody somewhere, and you just happen to got a few. That's good. Yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, Linda, for sharing. Ray, Bobby, not sure which of you are going to be joining. Okay, so Ray, please go ahead and join the conversation. Okay, let me try. Okay, there you are.
Well, Bryan brings up a lot of philosophical questions about the issues and origins of what we call sin. So, looking at it and all the variations in the DNA, the question comes about, well, did God give us DNA that could not vary at all? Well, that would seem to take away this free choice and all the rest of the stuff. Or did it just give us DNA and say, well, certain parts of that can change over time, but other parts can't? But sin came along and changed it and said, oh, everything can change now. To me, the whole idea of this variation, it blows a lot of supposed tied in place religious knowns, for me at least, out the back window. Now, maybe that's all philosophical, but to me, it points out that our preoccupation with who to call sinners, who we call saved or not saved, is really just trash talking, to put it in simple words. And we have no business doing that. I mean, this and other topics you've had sort of throws this whole idea of the binary sex system totally out the door. I mean, to me, I have a hard time understanding it from a conservative viewpoint unless I throw out anything scientific.
Yeah.
If we're going to be human, to me, I say, hey, that's pretty cool. God created diversity, which would make sense to me. But it does not make sense that he looked at this long string of DNA and said, nope, can't change any of those. Oh, sin comes along. Oh, darn. So I see your talk about the diversity and everything is a reinforcement for really free choice and everything. I think it's kind of exciting, kind of opens the mind of looking at everything, and everybody is equal. It's just there. We're all the same. We have the same abilities to change whatever. So I don't know how theology majors can really deal with genetics. And
Yeah, no, and I think what I find fascinating from what I kind of take from your statements too. I look back at the Romans chapter 9, and it seems like Paul's grappling with some of these questions. But you see, his worldview at that time was that God determined what everybody is. But that's very troubling when you think, oh, God made me this way. Is it better if it just is because it is random variation? Genetics changes, there's mutations, and we get what we have. Personally, I find that to be better because, for true freedom, God would have to let genetic systems do things and change, I think. So yeah, I appreciate that. That's an interesting perspective, but one that clearly I think is some genetics.
Yeah, sounds like an argument for grace.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Of course. The truth be told, Paul is making an argument for grace too. He just does it a different way. And as I said, the bigger perspective is that it's all supposed to be grace. But I find it really hard to wrap my head around it the way that Paul does, or without genetics. For me. So yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thanks again, Ray, for sharing that. Ed, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Yes, thank you, Bryan, for opening up a lot of questions for me, at least. One of the areas I want to talk to you about is to do with ancestry DNA tests, for example. There's 23andMe, MyHeritage, Ancestry.com, which was purchased by Blackstone, I think, about 3 years ago for almost $5 billion. So there's a lot of, so it's the largest for-profit DNA testing. And CBC, that's a national television news company in Canada, decided to do some analysis of DNA testing. And so they discovered that the same company, I think it was 23andMe, who tested identical twins, found different results, even though their DNA supposedly is identical, right? And they found a lot of other discrepancies. In fact, as the databases grew, then they found that the results changed, actually, for the same individuals who were previously tested. So the reliability, it seems, of these DNA testing companies is in question. And then there's a difference between DNA and heritage. Heritage implies where a person lived, where they grew up, what their culture was, and so forth. And of course, that has a big influence also on even things like politics, for example.
Mhm.
So my question to you is, how reliable how much faith can we put into someone's DNA when these so-called expert DNA testing companies seem to get it wrong, so to speak, in a number of cases?
Yeah, well, and one of the things that I should say about 23andMe and any of the places that do this, what we need to realize is what they're actually what data they're actually using. They're using those SNPs that I pointed out in my talk, the differences that occur at individual base pairs between people in the population. And they're working on the assumption, well, I shouldn't say assumption, but they're working on data sets where they've collected SNPs across all kinds of different populations. And they have discovered that some populations have certain SNPs more than others, and that's what helps them give you your heritage. The problem is that it depends on your sample as to the results you get. And as you get larger samples, sometimes the results can change because the distribution of those SNPs starts to change. So it isn't necessarily so much the changes in individuals over time, which they do too, by the way. I mean, but not a great deal. There's going to be some mutations, but the data set is a moving target. And so it could change. And also the different companies may have different sources of data, which are going to slightly skew things as well. I think though, as the databases get larger and larger, there's going to be less inconsistency. And so I think they can be useful, but as you point out, there's also the cultural heritage that doesn't reside in the DNA. And I think, we are nature and nurture. I've emphasized nature today, but nurture is part of our makeup too. And I think a person could take their results from 23andMe and maybe make a wrong conclusion about themselves because they didn't grow up in the culture in which, let's say, their heritage from DNA claims they should have or something. And I've known people that have got kind of like maybe confused in a way about who they are because of the differences between the results from 23andMe and what their family, where their family lived and came from and so on. So, but let me also just say one other thing about 23andMe. Well, another thing that people are finding out is sometimes they find out they're not a part of the family they thought they were.
Oh, nice.
Because, yeah, no, there have been people that have found out that they were adopted and nobody ever told them, or that they found out that they were the product of incest, and that had never been said before. So there's some pretty also scary things that sometimes can come out of these 23andMe things, and I don't know how much disclaimer they give people or how much help they give people in dealing with the kind of results that might come out of this. I mean, what if you do it and you find out, oh, I'm related to related to some criminal, that you never knew who's part of the family, but 23andMe links you up. So things like that. So, but you're right. There is some question about the how accurate it is, and I think I would just say we need to keep our eyes on it because I think the accuracy is going to get better, but it's not perfect at this point. And my bigger concern about 23andMe is not the ancestry part, but they also can give you data on your predispositions to genetic diseases. And I think that's the more dangerous side because those things truly are based on population statistics that don't speak to the individual very well. In other words, if I find out I have a gene that predisposes me for, let's say, Alzheimer's disease, it doesn't necessarily tell me what potential I have to get Alzheimer's disease. Because it's not just that gene that determines it, it's a lot of other genes that all play a part too. And without accounting for all that, I can't really say. I mean, certainly if I have a gene that is usually found in people with Alzheimer's, it may mean, yes, I do have a higher potential of having Alzheimer's, but I don't know how much more, so we could also unintentionally scare people. So yes, I would be cautious. I agree with you, Ed, that there are some definite, accuracy and also the fact that the results are going to change over time as the data sets get larger. So, yeah.
All right. Thanks so much, Ed, for raising that. Linda, so lovely to see you. Please go ahead, join the conversation.
You too, Sherry Ann. Thank you so much. Bryan, you have such a wonderful ability to take really complex and frightening PowerPoint slides and making them seem very understandable for those of us who are not scientifically minded. The general impression I came away with is that you might want to consider retitling your presentation to this: Genetics as a Rebuttal to Perfectionism. Because I feel very humbled and actually comforted by the idea that at my age in life, I don't, it's good to have information. It's good to be informed for health reasons, perhaps, as you said. But the things that affect me based on my genetic makeup are things that I see as largely outside of my control. I am a little disturbed in that eye chart that when one parent has brown eyes and the other blue, that there's no statistical possibility of a green-eyed child. Sadly, with my green eyes, I'm wondering about that, but my mother is dead, so I can't ask her any hard questions. But in any case, I suspect that I, like most people here, have not been genetically tested. And so it we operate in the dark for all intents and purposes. And I just wanted to share, I don't have so much of a question, but I wanted to share one thing that happened to me this week, because it seems to me to be the other side of the coin. And the thing that in my mind is perhaps for us as Christians, as believers, would perhaps even be of greater significance. And the circumstance, very short story, is this: I attended a funeral this week at the church for the wife of a man that is my good friend. And the eulogy that was given by a retired Seventh-day Adventist minister. And he used an obscure text in Isaiah that really had to do with the prophecy regarding the fact that Josiah, if you recall the story, God, through the prophetess Huldah, Josiah as king was told that he would die before the really terrible trouble happened to Israel, that he would be spared the experience of living through that. And what this pastor did is that he said that, well, the righteous die, and your wife, she was righteous. He told us that God decides when you die, which astounded me. But he said this. He said God decides, and then the rest of that text talks about people being protected from evil. And basically, when it was beautiful language. He was a very effective speaker. But when you got right down to it, when you distilled his words down to their bottom line meaning, what he said was, God killed your wife because she was weak, because she wouldn't be able to live through troublous times. And I sat there chilled to the bone in the pew, hoping that my friend, the bereaved husband, was so aggrieved that this just went over his head and it didn't even sink in for him. But think, predestination normally is considered in the context of God having decided everything that will happen. And that's precisely the message that this man gave to this grieving family. And I found it really disturbing, because to me it is a misperception of God and who he is. And also, speaking of Rick Rice, a misperception of what God is really theologically enabled to do here on this earth. But I just wonder about, if you have a thought, I'm certainly interested in it.
Yeah, no, and my wife reminded me, I do know Rick Rice. I just somehow his name didn't click in my brain. I actually do know him. So, and we've actually done a presentation together one time. So it's been a while since I did that. But in regard to this text that was used, that chimes with me very closely too. I have a sister who died when she was 39 from bladder cancer, and some of my family members who are very devout Adventists, third generation Adventist family on one side, basically said, "Oh, well, God let her die now so she wouldn't have to go through the time of trouble." Yeah, and I did not appreciate that personally. For some reason, some of them appeared to be comforted by that. So I guess part of it is knowing that, we're all made up differently, both from how we were raised in some ways and also by our genetics. I mean, the point is people are what they are sometimes. And so I have to be compassionate towards people who believe those kinds of things too.
Yes, but
but yeah,
but this is a man speaking. This is a man in a position of
yeah,
authority, and he's telling us what God is from
yeah.
his through his position of
Mhm.
authority. And I think that is the problem. But I
Yeah,
really
no.
appreciated. I mean, I appreciated your presentation. I mean, if I had been that husband, if that had been my loved one, I thought, well, if I'd known she was weak, maybe I could have helped her. Maybe I could have done something. It's like it's plucked from our hands, and we have
Mhm.
no say, no involvement. And once again, I just think that's it paints God, I think, in a very arbitrary light, and I think that's a wrong picture.
Well, and frankly, I think that that's a maybe, at least in our 20th century understanding of the world, it would seem to me that we would have come across issues like, okay, well, just an example. Um, Somebody gets cancer and God miraculously heals them. At least that's the story, right? God miraculously. Well, why didn't he miraculously heal my sister?
Right.
Well, it was God's plan. But see, I think we have gotten stuck into this idea that God plans absolutely every one of our lives down to when we're going to die, when maybe that wasn't what God's even ever tried to tell us. Although the Bible doesn't say that a lot, it seems, and that's what Paul's message here is. And this is why chapter 9 of Romans does bother me. If you read the whole book of Romans, it sort of takes the edge off of chapter 9, but nevertheless it's very troubling to me that Paul says, "Who are you, the clay, to question God what He decided to do to you?" I mean, it's I don't know. I feel like I should be able to question that.
Well, bear in mind, of course, you do
Yeah.
that in those days, and particularly with Jewish culture, that it was an absolute belief that there was a one-to-one
Mhm.
correlation between God and everything that happened to you. If you were rich,
Yeah.
you were favored. If you were sick or poor, then you were in God's disfavor. And so that I think that was just part of, as we like to say, unscientifically, part of their DNA. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and then of course we have the book of Job, which could have been very different if we couched it in modern understanding of things, I would think. But even that reinforces that. But Job does question it at least, so we know they had
Yes,
the
yes,
question.
he does. He does. Anyway,
Yeah,
thank you so much.
yeah, yeah.
Thank you so much, Linda, for that. Chris, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Oh, thank you so much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Bryan. Been away camping and other things, and nice to be here today. Your presentation led me to Ellen White's phrase "inherited tendencies" that she
Mm,
talks a bit about, and I kind of looked her up there and posted a quote in the chat that caused a couple of comments. But Ellen White seems to, indicate that all our inherited tendencies to evil can be overcome through conversion, repentance, and just good, strong willpower, powered by the presence of God in our lives. And so I think, that's just my question in terms of that, how that might relate to some of this. The idea of some people having a inherited indication of departing from organized religion on that one slide you showed, was very interesting to me, in that as I look at both sides of my family tree, a lot of my cousins and my great aunts and their children, a lot of them, though they may have had some Adventist upbringing as children over the last 100 years, have all, or many of them, have departed from Adventist belief and Adventist membership and Adventist participation. And even now, I find myself in that process of deconstruction for a variety of other reasons. I'm here today rather than at my local church, so I found that to be very interesting and fascinating. It brings up, and I don't know if your wife is still in earshot, Bryan, but when Bob Newhart died here a few weeks ago, she and I and maybe you and others were talking about his comedy
just
routine.
stop.
His comedy routine as a psychiatrist, classic one.
Yeah.
Just stop it. That seems to be Ellen White's counsel as well. Just, you have these inherited things from your parents. She really lays the guilt trip on mom and dad. You have a responsibility of making sure your children you do not pass on any of this stuff to your kids. and you have to set a good example and all of that stuff. And that's just kind of where my mind went with this. And there seems to be just, yeah, we have we have a predisposition towards some things, as Dr. Johnson was mentioning, but we also have a choice to say, no. And at times our predisposition overrides our choice, and vice versa, I think. And therefore, we just should have a lot more grace to people who are alcoholics, who are gay and lesbian, and etc. I think is what I see in this. I loved Linda's observation that this blows perfectionism out of the water. We're all just on the journey with God.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, and I think I think one of the more troubling things isn't the genetic thing. It's that discovery through brain scans. Where they've done brain scans with people while they're making decisions, making moral decisions per se. They ask a question and give an answer, and they discover that the brain activity that's associated with making that decision happens before the person consciously thought about the thing, thought about the decision itself. And then what happens is people make up reasons afterward why they made the decision, even though their subconscious had already just done it without their intervention whatsoever. And that's what troubles me a little bit, because if that is really true, if that's the way things are happening, we don't necessarily have that free will to say, just stop it, which every therapist wishes they could tell their patient. And I'm sure that's what Ellen White was hoping to tell every Adventist, just stop it. But, and we feel like we have that power. Now, I think it's dangerous, though, to think we don't have any power there either. I don't think that's true, because they actually did experiments also with people who were informed that they didn't have free will. They informed about the experiments and how it actually works, how we actually do make our decisions. And what they discovered is, when they did games and things, that those individuals that were given that information were more likely to cheat, because it's, why not? I mean, I'm not responsible for that. And so I think it's dangerous to go too far down that road, because I do think we do have a degree of free will. I mean, but I think it's driven by, as Judy and I mentioned earlier, about habit, really, that you have to make that decision more times. And sometimes maybe it has to start after you made that subconscious decision. You change your mind, so to speak. And eventually the subconscious, I think, begins to track that. So I think that in terms of therapy, I mean, a person can change, and there is some free will involved. On the other hand, as you also point out, and I think we would all agree here, that some people don't have even that basic level. What about somebody who's a schizophrenic? I mean, where are they going to get the free will to make the kind of decisions, life decisions, that we, as, say, an Adventist, say you need to make to be saved? Where would that ever happen? And that's why ultimately there's also this question of God's fairness. And I appreciate Lauren bringing it up. I think God's going to work that out, I guess. I don't know. I mean, I hope that God takes all that into account, and I think he will. But it is very troubling to be a part of an organization, and this is not just Adventists, this is I think churches in general, that believe that I'm saved because of the things I choose to believe in. And if I don't choose to believe those things, I can't be saved. When some people maybe are already predisposed not to even be able to choose to believe such things. It's just not in their constitution. It's not there. And would it be fair for God to say, "Oh, sorry, well, if you can't, you're done for. I'm not going to take you." So and that's where I think this really the deeper part of the questions I was asking, I think we need to grapple with that. And I don't know that we'll ever get an answer, but at least we need to be much more aware of where the trouble lies in our moral systems that we've set up. And I think it plays into the way we deal with criminals too, because I don't think we should go around saying, "Oh, criminals aren't responsible for what they did," but we do need to recognize what led them to become criminals in the first place. And that's why the rehabilitation part is more important, I think, than the punishment. So anyway, that's where I hope that our theological thinking would also head somewhat more in that direction. And I hear you saying that too. It sounds like.
Yeah. Oh yeah. The Adventist tendency, as Linda was mentioning, of that line is probably one of the top three things not to say somebody who is grieving, is that God must have needed them in heaven more than you did, and God has laid them to rest before the time of trouble, which I think is an Ellen White idea that she comforts somebody with at some point. I call that invasion of the divine body snatcher. And I just can't fathom that. I'm comforted by the verse in Ecclesiastes, I think, more than anything with that. It says, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, that one. And it says, time and chance happen to all men. And we live in this world, the country western chorus, he says, when you're spinning around, things come undone. Welcome to the earth, third rock from the sun. We live in a world of chance and great randomness, as that we started this whole thing. There's random things that happen. Planes crash. People get cancer, even though they ate well and ate all the big franks they could in their life. They still got sick, and it's not their fault. I think sometimes we as Adventists, we consider it a fault. Oh, well, he drank coffee, that's why he got bladder cancer, or any number of other blame. We always look for this little blame thing. Why can't we just accept that someday you're going to die too, even though you followed the health message? Adventists die healthier than all other people, I think.
Yeah. No, and I think it might be healthier if we just said, oh, the person's dead, their suffering is over. There you go.
They're resting,
and we have to now, right? And so we have to now live past their death, and we're sad. We've lost them. I've lost those connections. Why blame anybody? Why blame God in any way whatsoever for the fact that they lived or died? I'm still bothered by the thing of people saying, "Oh, I was miraculously cured too." That's the same. That's the flip side of that. Why were you miraculously cured? But as I say, my sister wasn't. It just it hurts. So.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Chris, for raising all of that. Dr. Johnson, welcome back to the conversation.
Yeah, thanks for letting me come back. First of all, to Linda McZeal, they've determined that the people who built Stonehenge were dark-skinned with blue eyes. Second thing, when people ask me if somebody's going to be saved, I tell them I'm not on that committee. But that said, I think some of us may be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. The moral environment of a community and the moral training that a community gives to its members is an important part of their we talked about epigenetics and everything. It affects their genetics, apparently. Just as much as a traumatic event, or their environment is not totally separable from their genetics. Their environment affects their genetics. And so moral training, you say some people, when they make a decision, the beginning of that decision was before they were conscious of the process. That's undoubtedly true, but that is partly conditioned by the training that they've received. And so I think teaching people the way we expect them to behave is not as useless an activity as some of you seem to be suggesting, because it affects their genetics. Well, I could go on about that, but I'll leave it at that. Clarence Darrow, the famous trial lawyer, of course, raised this issue of people really shouldn't be blamed for what they are. They couldn't help being what they are, and therefore they couldn't help being what they do. While that is true, it would be a very damaging doctrine to make the orthodoxy of our society.
Yeah, and that's why balance is really important here. And you say that moral training affects genetics. Well, it's not just that it affects genetics, it affects the person, because even whatever your genetics are, even if it doesn't change it, environment is part of what makes you you. And moral training is part of the environment. So there's no doubt that we have to. And I think when we talk about criminality, and I mentioned, punishment versus rehabilitation. Well, rehabilitation is one of the responses to that. And I don't know that punishment's always wrong either. So yeah, I think balance is important, because we could easily throw the baby out with the bathwater if we just said, oh yeah, everybody's actions are because they're genes. Well, but they're not completely. So that, yeah, good point.
All right. Thank you so much, Bob, for raising that. Curtis, it is now time for you to join the conversation. Please go ahead and unmute. There you go.
Thank you for that. Am I being heard?
Yes, we can hear
Yeah.
you.
Very good. I see we still have 110 participants. I hope that somewhere in that lot there is an expert on heaven who can tell me, where is heaven? Up there somewhere? When Jesus was resurrected, went to heaven, he came back and appeared to the disciples on the road to Emmaus. That is only a few days or months, not even as long as a year, surely. So heaven has to be less than 1 light year away from here. The James Webb Space Telescope sees billions of light years out there. They see the past going back billions of years, but the JWST is infrared. Does that mean that heaven does not produce any infrared? All you need for infrared is a warm body. Are there no warm bodies in heaven? Somebody help me out here. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I find it interesting myself that the Old Testament doesn't really specify much about heaven either. So, interesting question. One that I'm not ready to tackle either. Thanks, Curtis.
Yeah, thanks, Curtis. Definitely, one of those things that we can think about. Lauren, I'm gonna ask you to unmute, join the conversation. I know usually around 3:30 you like to wrap up, so I don't know if you want to ask your question first and then do that.
Yeah, I'm not going to ask the question. I'm just going to let you know who's coming up. I have next week another of our favorite teachers, Lawrence Turner, professor emeritus from DeWitt College, and he's generally does Old Testament topics, and the one he's going to do next week is going to be Jonah, and he describes it. He says it's a rollicking good story. And he calls it the bias of the pious. And I think there has been a lot of you being a biologist, Bryan. You should enjoy the questions surrounding this guy going into a fish, not a whale, a fish, for several days and coming out again. So that's what he's going to be talking about. And then the week after that, I have Sigve Tonstad from Loma University School of Religion. And he hasn't given me a topic yet. He sometimes talks about Revelation, but he's lately been branching out into other topics. And when I ask him about talking about Revelation, he says, no, I'd rather try out this new thing that I'm working on. So we'll see how that turns out. So yeah, very, very, very good topic today, Bryan. Something that has been interesting to me is not so much what we inherit, but when you see children who are extremely different in some significant way from their parents. That's always interesting too, isn't it? It's not just the way we're the same, but the way that we end up being very, very different. Some of you have children who just went exactly the opposite direction from your faith or your way of living or your work, and you say, I raised this kid a certain way. How did they turn out like this? And it's a puzzling question, but a really good one. And again, I just have to say, God only knows, and God gets to decide. I just am absolutely sure that I am not going to make the determination of, as Bob said, whether I'm not on that committee, whether they're going to be saved or lost. Thank you very much, Bryan. It was great.
Yeah, and Lauren, just one comment on the kids being different. We have two kids that are like different species. Um, we always wonder, where did that happen?
Oh,
But
yeah.
Yeah, well, keep in mind that
It's
heritability.
amazing. And here's
Yeah,
another thing that a psychologist pointed out to me one time, a lecture that I heard. He said, have you ever noticed that sometimes there'll be an alignment that you didn't expect between a grandparent and a grandchild? And he said, I've seen it so often where mom and dad say, I can't understand this kid. And grandma will say, I can. And I think that is actually very interesting in a genetic sort of sense. So, for what that's worth.
Yeah. Well, one of the reminders is that remember that heritability statistics, those numbers I've been sharing, those are population statistics.
Yes. They're not.
And so yeah, exactly. So in the particular, they may not, they're not predictive in the particular. Okay. They're predictive of the group.
Exactly.
So I can say, that 80% of the people who, inherit these sets of genes are going to develop, say, schizophrenia, but that doesn't mean that you will. So you see, that's how I think we need to be careful about how we use those statistics. And and we have to always remember we still don't know how much of us is nature and how much is nurture.
Exactly.
And I don't know that we ever will. And I think for each person, that's going to be a different answer anyway. And that's why I think only God can
maybe
judge.
Maybe there's a presentation in here somewhere that Judy or you could do, where you talk about how we nurture people with true respect for what their actual nature is, rather than saying, I've got to force you into this mold that I have, to look at everybody in what God has created them to be and respect them for that. Anyway, thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you again, Bryan. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I think we have other therapists here that maybe one of them could tackle that too. That'd be great. I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Lauren. Ed, always enjoy your thought-provoking questions. Please go ahead and join the conversation.
Oh, thank you. Bryan, I'm really sorry I missed your presentation, but I've been enjoying the conversation. I hope I don't stumble onto something you've already covered. I don't know if many people know it. This is just a little factoid. But Loma Linda has actually been doing research on the impact of lifestyle on genetic dispositions. I'm not sure I'm using the right terminology, but a foundation whose board I was on actually gave them money to buy a gene sequencer for the project. So they're actually exploring what is the impact of lifestyle on our genetic tendencies and so forth. There was trying to remember when it was 1970 or 80 something. The Harvard Business Review put out an article they have ever published in their history. And it's called Who's Got the Monkey? And it's really all about management and whether or not managers allow their subordinates to transfer the monkey from the subordinates back to the boss's back. And I've been recently thinking about that old article. Yeah.
Yeah, just a second here. And Sherry Ann, I'm gonna have to step out just briefly to help my mom get in our house. So I'll let you converse, and I'll be back.
Okay.
So I'm gonna go blank.
All right, Ed, go ahead.
So I've been thinking about this article in the trying to transfer the idea to the field of spirituality. And I feel like I may be the only one that feels this way, but I doubt it. I feel like in the Seventh-day Adventist culture, especially for us older people, that the monkey was always on my back for my salvation. And I'm just wondering if that's true. I'm kind of starting to believe that God has more the monkey on his back for my salvation. I like to think about the text in Philippians 1:6, where I'm paraphrasing, where Paul says that the one that began a good work in you will surely bring it to perfection. Says nothing about me. It says what he who began a good work in you will do. And that kind of implies that the monkey's on God's back. Maybe my job is not to worry about my genetic compositions and my tendencies, because we have the promise of transformation that's above and beyond ourselves. And I guess that's all I want to say. But maybe the out from our genetic predispositions is that God has transformational power. We don't understand it. We probably don't even know it when it's happening. But I just believe that's the key to the deal. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. And yeah, I agree that there is the transformational power that we consider. There's a nature and the nurture, and there are so many other more complex aspects of this that we just don't understand. And actually, we don't need to to understand, because I believe God is a lot more gracious, definitely than humans, and definitely than we give him credit for. And we don't sit on those committees that decides who will change, who will be saved, or any of that, which I think is a very good thing. So yeah, definitely thank you for sharing. Lauren, I noticed you were loving Ed's comments. I don't know if you want to chime in here on that.
No, I just want to thank Ed for making a very pertinent comment. It was excellent. Thank you. Ed always does.
All right. Thank you so much, Ed. Bill, please go ahead and join the conversation.
I appreciate Ed's observation that he doesn't, he feels a sense perhaps that the monkey's not on his back. And I would say there is a certain freedom in not being free. The epigenetics concept tends to support the reality that we are all in this together. So maybe we're not free, and maybe we are all in this together. And if I probably am misreading John 3:17, but maybe not. For God sent his Son not to condemn, not to make distinctions, but to save the creation, the world. It may not be a good theodicy or a suitable one, but maybe it's a point that is encouraging in the moment. And we live in moments. Just a thought. Thank you.
Yeah, I just came in at the last of that, but I loved John 3:17, and when I said that I think we need to read Paul in context, I think that's good to bring up a verse like that.
Okay.
Because there is, and you mentioned something about epigenetics. I guess I should add one thing. There is ongoing research on the potential to reprogram epigenetic markers, and so maybe at some point we might have an additional tool in our tool bag for helping people to change maybe some of those tendencies that have been hardwired in.
I think Ed mentioned that Loma Linda is working on some of the some research along this line. I may not have remembered what I just said, but it was something along that line, changing actually the genetics.
Well, and I think they're focusing on is looking at how diet compares to a person's actual genetic makeup. That we each have different genetic makeup, and different diets might be more appropriate to different genetic backgrounds. So I think that's part of it too. I have not looked at it personally though, so I need to look at that. It'd be interesting to see what they're actually doing.
All right. Thank you so much, Bill, for sharing. Eduardo, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Thank you, Bryan. I don't know if you are familiar with Sister Huay speaking about the color line or the color scheme. She mentioned that in heaven won't be black and whites. She said that everybody's going to have the complexion of Adam and Eve, which was reddish. What do you think?
I always remember the song when I was a kid. What was it? The red and yellow, black and white, and that was what I figured heaven was going to be. So that one's puzzled me. I know that Ellen White, of course, was alive during a time period that was much more racist than it is today, and I have no doubt that she was influenced, unfortunately, by some of that milieu. And I think the Christian tendency to somehow see Jesus as white and white good, black bad, that somehow seeped in there. I think in a statement like that. I don't know how serious we should take it, but I certainly wouldn't advocate for that. I think that our world is wonderful the way it is, with all of the different racial groups and their. Oh, it's just, to me, we would lose something if we all were white in heaven. So yeah. But so maybe we need to sing that song some more these days and remind ourselves of that the world is a wonderfully diverse place, and I think heaven will be too. But yeah, that was a disappointment. I've heard that quote before, and it kind of disappointed me that got there into her statement. But yeah, ouch.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Eduardo. Richard, please go ahead and join the conversation.
Hi, Sherry Ann. Hey, that background that you show tugs at my heartstrings.
It's a picture in Barbados, so you're welcome to visit.
It's gorgeous. Yeah. Having spent over half my life in Florida and spent some time sailing those beautiful waters, I'm now living in the upstate of South Carolina. And somehow the mountains don't quite make up for the loss. Hey, Bryan, great presentation. And I was thinking, this is kind of along the lines of what Ed was sharing, but I was thinking when you were quoting quite liberally from Paul about the statements that he makes, and these are really loose paraphrases. In Christ, we are new creations, and old things have passed away. Perhaps Ephesians 2, where it talks about what Christ does at our acceptance of him. Let this mind be in you that is in Christ Jesus. Or David, clear back in the Old Testament, create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit within me. And I wonder, is there some mechanism going on that maybe isn't completely understood or described or explained by genetics? And is there perhaps some supernatural force which changes the natural tendencies of the natural bent that we come with?
Yeah. Well, and I think I think when we look, that's why I said context is important here. I don't know that we want to take chapter 9 all by itself, because it's sort of a rather grim view of how of humanity, I think. So I think to say that God has no way of changing people or accepting people in their brokenness or whatever it may be. No, I mean, I think Paul goes in lots of other directions there, and why I think we can look towards better things. But I have to believe that God has that ability, because why would he leave us stuck where we are? I guess for me, I just hold hope that he also has a way of doing that for people with schizophrenia, for example, because I think it would be unfair for him to simply judge them based on this condition they're in, and leave them there. So I'm with all those that have said it, Lauren and others who've said, yeah, I'm not on that committee, but I think God will bring about positiveness. So yeah.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you so much. I think that theme of grace and not being on that committee keeps coming up.
Yeah.
Doug,
Sherry Ann,
Teresa.
I'm going to have to also let you, Sherry Ann, I'm going to let you know I'm going to leave in about 5 minutes here. So just let you know.
Okay, well, we just have two hands. So Doug, Teresa, please be quick. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Bryan. Excellent presentation. It reminds me that when I tend to shift into a binary world, it's probably not the model that God designed. I love the fact that he designed rainbows, and when you see them from above, they're actually not a bow, it's a circle. And I think that's instructive to me. I'm mindful of what Dr. Johnson mentioned earlier about moral training in the community. And I look back on my experience in a tightly knit community, Adventist community, and some of that was really excellent. I also am very keenly aware that some of that set me up for difficulties, and my siblings as well. And so I think that goes both ways. It reminds us that we have an influence, and that influence can either create trauma. Repetitive small traumas are as effective as one big trauma. I learned that in my life. And so I'm mindful of that. The other thing it brought to mind, you mentioned briefly Richard Rice. Several years back, I read Greg Boyd's comment on open theology, or open view of God, open theism. And he came up with the idea of 80-20, which he freely admits has no scientific basis. At least that's my recollection, that you have about 80% which you have control over and 20% which you don't. I can't say that I was born in San Diego, for example, he says, because I wasn't. So I didn't have whatever influence was going on in San Diego. And so I appreciate that fact that life isn't completely open. And I loved embracing the idea of God's open theism because it helped me to reflect, I think, in my thinking about others, as you have helped, I think, us do this morning, that there is a part for which we have some responsibility. And there's also a part in which we're influenced greatly by things over which we have little or no control. And years back, when I was in a different position, our management went through Myers-Briggs Type Indicator training, MBTI, a matrix of 16 different characteristics. And I found out that I was an outlier, which didn't surprise me at all. It actually reaffirmed in my mind that something I thought was that, long thought was that I was, in fact, an outlier, as even among Adventists. And so I like to think that today and this Sabbath school is perhaps a class of outliers. And I'm very, very happy to be a part of that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I think I like your view there of God of being more the open theism, which I also remember Terry talking about when I've been around him. So but the idea that I think we need to maybe embrace that as well when we deal with others, because I'm hoping that as I have shared how much of us is influenced by genetics, that we would also be compassionate then with other people to realize, they're not doing that just to annoy me or to give me problems or, because they hate God or something. Part of it's just what they are. And they have that same compassion that I think God must have for such individuals. So I think we need to work on that more, in my opinion, anyway. So, yeah, thank you.